Hey everyone, welcome back. David in History for the Ages here. So this was a topic one of my subscribers actually said, "Hey David, could you do this video? It'd be very interesting." And I thought, wow, I agree. Actually, it'd be a lot of fun to talk about, which is weapons through the centuries and how they've evolved from literally pre-civilization all the way until today. Now, obviously, this is a huge topic you could spend a lifetime learning about. So please leave comments, right, about maybe some stuff I'm not going to talk about in terms of weapons you're familiar with or you think are really interesting. I love it when people leave comments because I can learn from it, all the other viewers can learn from it, and it just makes some really good, interesting back and forth for everyone to learn from. And so we'll start from the very beginnings, right? Pre-civilization, what we call the Paleolithic period. The word Paleolithic, paleo actually means old, right? Like paleontologist, lithic means stone, and therefore these pre-civilization societies use stone tools and stone weapons. So when you go to the very beginning, right, if you want to start way back then, you had a wooden stick. You tie in a sharpened stone to it, and there's your weapon. There's your spear. So there isn't much to say about this very early period, other than this is how it all began. It also shows us that, even before civilization begins, human nature had a need for weapons. Tells us something, of course, about human nature, right? And we move on to, of course, the Bronze Age. So after the end of the Paleolithic period and Mesolithic and then Neolithic period, we get to the Bronze Age, which is between about 3000 and 1000 BC. There are a lot of civilizations that existed during the Bronze Age period. One of the more famous, of course, is the ancient Egyptians. And the Egyptians did start to use spears, but they had bronze tipped on them. So obviously that's going to be metal is going to have a different impact in fighting than using a stone tool or stone spear. Now, the other big innovation that we oftentimes see during the Bronze Age period is the use of chariot fighting. So this is kind of, again, it's hard to pick everything. I'm just going to pick a few things from each period of time that I think is pretty cool. And a lot of people mistakenly think this was first by the Egyptians, but it was not. This image is, of course, an Egyptian image, but chariot fighting goes back to the Sumerians. We also know there's another civilization known as the Hittites who really revolutionized chariot warfare, made them faster, lighter. If you're not familiar with the Hittites, they're a civilization that lived in Asia Minor, and they had a big war called the Battle of the War of Kadesh against ancient Egypt. And so while the Egyptians are oftentimes seen as one of these societies that had the chariots, there were other Bronze Age civilizations and other civilizations that used chariot fighting as well. But this is a pretty important advancement going from stone tools to metal. And of course, metal is going to have a much bigger impact. We then move on to what we call the Iron Age. So by 1000 BC, we enter the Iron Age. And during that time, we're going to start to see the story of the ancient Greeks. Now, the Greeks actually started before anyone screamed, yeah, the Greeks existed before the Iron Age. Yes, they did, right? The Greeks go back before. You had the earliest Greek people, the Mycenaeans, and so forth. And then eventually you have this kind of what we call Greek Dark Age period. And then from there, after that period, from about 800 BC to about 300 BC, you kind of have the heart of the Greek world. And during that time period, yes, they are using iron, right? And the other thing, of course, if you just want to learn all the history of this stuff, I have playlists on everything in ancient Egypt, on Greeks, on Romans, in the Middle Ages. And so you can always go to my channel, look for my playlist, and find a lot just the basic history of all this stuff. And so one of the things we know is the Greeks had what we call hoplite warriors. We call them hoplite warriors because they used a round wooden shield called a hoplon shield, which was made out of wood. But they also had iron weapons. So they had a spear that was commonly used called a dory, and it was tipped with iron instead of bronze. They still did use bronze for like defensive, so they oftentimes had a bronze chest plate. And they also, really interestingly, developed leather as a form of armor. That they would weave a whole bunch of layers together, and it would be kind of almost like it could almost stand a spear blow right to you if you had it done well. And so this is something we see from the ancient Greeks is that they developed better weaponry, better armor to use in fighting. If you ever saw the movie The 300, of course, they kind of go over the top with some of the things in that movie. And one of the things I tell my students is like, they don't even show them with armor in the movie, chest plates, but they did wear them. The other really cool thing I like to talk about the ancient Greeks are their ships. And this is an image of the trireme ships. If you ever study any of those battles that the Greeks were involved in the Persian War, for example, these ships played a very big role in those Persian wars. So you can kind of get a sense these are pretty good, naval warfare that we're going to see. So I'm going to try to combine some different types of weaponry used throughout history in this video. All right, then of course we got to talk about ancient Rome. This is a cool image I actually have from when I went to a military reenactment years ago, and you had the Roman soldiers there. And this is kind of the typical things that people see with ancient Rome. Probably of all the civilizations I talk about, people are familiar with the scutum and the gladius, the short sword, and you can see how the Roman soldiers dressed, and they walked in very tight formations when they marched, very disciplined. But they also had really amazing siege warfare as well. One of the things they had is this ballista device that was first invented by the Greeks, but then the Romans used it very effectively. So you could just kind of archers that you would use, not archers, but arrows you would put in there and it would fling them. They had catapults. And this is one that I think a lot of people aren't familiar with, so I wanted to throw this in there. Something called the Ravens. So during one of the wars that the Romans were involved in, during the First Punic War against Carthage, and again, I have a whole video on this, the Romans needed to find a way to kind of change these sea battles to land battles, and they developed this device known as the Raven or the Crow. This is all described to us by the Roman historian Polybius. And you can see in this image here, it's pretty cool, right? It's basically this boarding plank with a system of levers and pulleys that you can rotate, and you can hook it onto the enemy ships and march your men across, basically changing land battles to sea battles to land battles while they were still on sea. Gave them an advantage. How much it was really used during those wars were kind of a bit debated, but it is something that we have written records account. So obviously Rome had one of the most effective, disciplined military, using all this, iron weaponry to do really well in terms of expansion and control. We then get to the Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages are obviously known for knights, as mounted warriors. Now, one of the interesting points here is if you study history, how is military connected to history? And so maybe you're familiar with the feudal system, right? In the feudal system, the whole idea was you had a lord and vassal, and the vassal would provide military service to the lord for land, for fee, for a piece of land. And we believe one possible way the whole feudal system began was the fact that in the Middle Ages was basically only nobles who fought. So if I'm a king and I want a military, I have to give land to these knights to fight for me. And so because you had this kind of very small elite group of soldiers, knights and mounted warriors was the major thing, you didn't have big, huge armies in a large part of the Middle Ages. As we get towards the end of the Middle Ages, that's going to change a bit. You also have a pretty important innovation during the Middle Ages, the stirrup, which actually, again, came from Asia, but it was very important for the Middle Ages because it allowed the riders greater stability in battle and making kind of a knight on a horse more effective. Now, this image that you see here is one of the coolest weapons from the Middle Ages, called the trebuchet. There's some cool videos you can find of people like flinging all sorts of stuff. You can fling a small car with one of these things. It's a lot of fun. It was probably invented somewhere in the Eastern world, but of course it's going to be used in the West and all sorts of places during the Middle Ages. So the trebuchet is a pretty cool medieval invention. There are, of course, several other weapons that you use. This is actually what got me to make this video. My subscribers sent me this kind of funny little video. When you grow up, people stop asking you what your favorite medieval blunt weapon is. They don't even care. And so here you can see a whole bunch of them. So you should make a video on weapons in throughout history. So I wanted to put this in there. But it also gives you an idea of some of the other weapons used in the Middle Ages. All right, we move out of the Middle Ages. We get into the modern world. And of course, the big shift is gunpowder in the cannon. And in fact, one of the reasons the Middle Ages ends is because of this. Folks, I don't know if anybody has ever gone archery shooting and then also gone, shooting in a range a gun. Good luck trying to shoot a gun wearing chainmail armor, right? The moment we start to get gunpowder and other forms of cannons and guns and so forth, a guy wearing chainmail armor is not going to be very effective. And, what's the old saying? Never bring a knife to a gunfight. And so when you start to see gunpowder, which goes all the way back to the like 9th century, probably in China, becomes more commonly used in the 14th century in the West, it does shift things. The Hundred Years' War is going to be dramatically impacted by this. It creates a shift in terms of how military is going to work. It breaks down the feudal system. One of the reasons the whole feudal system can't work anymore is because a knight on a horse is going to be pointless when a cannon's coming at you. Cannons also played a huge role. This image you see here actually is the fall of Constantinople, 1453. And so cannons were used to break the walls of Constantinople. So obviously castles aren't going to be as effective when you start to have cannons. So these are things that are going to really dramatically change as we enter what we would call the modern world, 1400s, 1500s, and then we start to see the innovations of military take further steps. Back to some naval battles. Look at some of the ships they start developing. So this is called the HMS Victory. I've actually had the pleasure to go on to this place. It's in southern England. And this is, of course, one of the ships used during the Napoleonic Wars. And you could see kind of the image from the outside, the cannons on the inside. And so you still see we're still using wooden ships at this point, but we're also not that far away in the terms of long history to getting into, of course, battleships. Actually, one of the things I don't have is images of battleships, but again, it's kind of crazy. One of the cool ships I've been to is the Midway, which was a ship that was used during, of course, World War II, and then they changed to a museum. It's harbored over in San Diego, California, and you see this, it's an aircraft carrier, and you see this aircraft carrier from World War II, and you go, wow, that's huge, and then you think of the ones they have today, and they're just like cities. It's crazy, but you see the constant, again, innovation in naval warfare. So this one I thought was pretty interesting to share. And then, of course, World War I, right? You can't talk about military fighting without World War I, because during World War I, several new weaponry were developed, right? Obviously, most infamous chemical weapons. This is when you're going to start using the mustard gas during World War I. Machine guns, World War I. Flamethrowers, World War I. Trenches themselves were not World War I. Trenches were used before World War I, but what you see during World War I are all of these new weaponries that made the trench warfare so brutal. Barbed wire, World War I. Air warfare, of course, the Zeppelin. All of this is really big dramatic changes that completely changed the course of history. We also know World War I had U-boats, but a lot of people think that's the first time U-boats were used in warfare, and that's actually not true. There was submarine fighting that dates back all the way probably to the American Revolution. And so you could actually go a little bit further back for submarine fighting. But they were more commonly used, these German U-boats, during World War I. And then, of course, we move on to the atomic age as we kind of move to more modern times. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this only because I already have several videos on this. I have a video on Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project. I have a video I made on who has the atomic bomb, and a really interesting one on something called the Samson option. So you can find all three of these on my channel, and you can learn a little bit more. I would start with Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project. And obviously, this is the ultimate game changer, because once we get to this atomic age and nuclear bombs, we have this ability to destroy the world. And, one of the interesting things about this entire video is all of these weapons, throughout history, good or bad. Well, it depends whose hands they're in, right? And depends how they're used. And I think that's kind of one of the most important points about everything. Human nature doesn't change, values change. It's one of the things I tell my students all the time. So, of course, end of World War II, we get the atomic age, we still have nuclear bombs, but in terms of one last topic, the future, current in the future, current military advancements. Of course, we got drone fighting, computer warfare, AI, who knows where that's going to go in terms of warfare. And so it's a ever evolving world in military. Interesting topic. I hope you learned some new things and kind of enjoyed this. Please, again, leave comments about some other warfare content you think is interesting, and watch all my history videos on all this stuff. Again, I have a ton of playlists on everything. That's it. I hope you found that interesting. You enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and have a great day.